Along with over 90% of Jews, I am Zionist. So I want to take some time to talk about Zionism, to explain what it is and why most Jews are Zionist. So I am Zionist because I believe it's absolutely critical and imperative to the survival of my people that we have self-determination in our indigenous and ancestral homeland. And I am also Zionist because of the link that we have to the land of Israel through our religious practice and spiritual beliefs and teachings. So Zionism is basically the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And that's what political Zionism is. So when I'm talking about Zionism, I'm basically talking about the political Zionist movement, which was born in the late 1800s. Political Zionism grew and evolved at the same time that other nationalist movements were growing across Europe. So as Europeans started to believe that ethnic groups should be entitled to self-determination, so too did the Jewish people living in Europe start to think that the Jewish people should be entitled to self-determination. So of course, when you're talking about the Ukrainians, they want self-determination in Ukraine, which is their indigenous homeland. And when you're talking about the Jewish people who happen to be living in Europe, we want self-determination in our indigenous homeland, which is Israel. So back to the word Zionism. Zion actually means Jerusalem. The word Zion, it was the name of a hill in Jerusalem, and eventually the word Zion became synonymous with Jerusalem, and then eventually it became synonymous with the land in which the Jews always lived, which was not just Jerusalem, but it was also Judea and beyond. Our time in Jerusalem dates back thousands of years, approximately 3,000 years. And that's if we set aside the Torah and the Bible as a source of information, and we only look at other historical evidence and archaeological proof. Our connection to this land is not only long, but it's also been continuous. There has been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel for 3,000 years, over 3,000 years. But the presence wasn't always in significant numbers. And the reasons why the Jewish presence in our indigenous land didn't remain consistent over time is because that land was taken over by various empires, and at different points in time in history, we were either killed or expelled from the land or taken out of the land as slaves. The disassociation of Jews from the land of Israel, from Zion, from Jerusalem, came by force. Early on, it was the Babylonians who exiled us from the land or killed us in the land. After the Babylonians, later it was the Romans. It was also the Greeks. Eventually, it were the Ottomans. The British did not engage in some campaign of terror and murder, but the British certainly limited the number of Jews that could live in the land of Israel under its colonization and occupation. And so we have this very long history of being tied to the land, despite the fact that we are constantly being expelled or murdered for living in the land. So during each of these expulsions, you basically end up with what is understood as diaspora Jewry. With each expulsion, Jews moved out of the land of Israel and into other lands. So initially, Jewish diaspora was across the Middle East. When the Babylonians exiled the Jews from the land of Israel, many ended up in what was controlled by the Babylonians, which is modern-day Iraq. Thousands of years, Jews lived in Iraq. And also across the Middle East, right? There were Jews in Egypt, there were Jews in Syria, there were Jews all across the Middle East, as well as into North Africa. And that came naturally during the early expulsions of Jews from the land. Later, when the Romans came, Jews left the land or were expelled from the land and moved into Europe. During the Spanish Inquisition, there were many Jews in Spain. And when the Spanish Inquisition took place, Jews were further displaced and moved further into Europe. We have this very long history of being expelled from the land, and yet this very long history of longing for the land. And for thousands of years, this longing for the land was deeply spiritual and religious, but it wasn't political. right? And so what does that mean that it was deeply spiritual and religious? So when we were expelled from Jerusalem, we no longer had a temple, could no longer engage in the ancient practice of sacrifice. Rabbinic Judaism began. And Rabbinic Judaism was basically the idea that we're going to have to find a way to maintain our people's practices and belief systems in other lands, in foreign lands, in the diaspora. And so there are synagogues that get set up, and we replace sacrifice with prayer. All the synagogues all across the world are oriented toward Jerusalem because Jerusalem is our home. We pray 3 times a day for return to Jerusalem. So we have those types of practices that orient us spiritually toward Jerusalem. And then we also have the simple fact that our Torah, our Bible, has 613 commandments. And of those commandments, over half of them can only be fulfilled in the land of Israel. So we have this long-term spiritual and religious connection to the land. We also have this long-term kind of indigenous tie to the land. We, the Jews, are from Judea. We are from Zion. We are from Jerusalem. That is where we are from. But if we fast forward to the late 1800s, at that time across Europe, you had this movement growing that was seeking self-determination of peoples. Because up until that time, throughout the entire history of the world, for the most part, all the different ethnic groups were being ruled by empires, right? You had the Roman Empire. And so it wasn't until the late 1800s that people started to think, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't be ruled by these giant empires. Maybe we should rule ourselves. This was a really revolutionary idea. It was a new idea. And Jews who were living in Europe also started thinking about that idea. Specifically, Theodor Herzl. He is considered kind of the father of political Zionism. And he wasn't a particularly religious Jew, but he certainly was experiencing oppression and discrimination as a Jew in Europe, and started to think that maybe the way the Jews move forward is by congregating in a meaningful way in our indigenous homeland, going back to Israel, rejoining with the Jews who are in Israel, and also inviting the Jews who are residing throughout the Middle East to also return to Israel. And we establish our own government and our own structure, and we have self-determination in our indigenous homeland. And that's what political Zionism is. That's what that modern movement is. So that modern movement has both the groundings and the foundation of the spiritual and the ancestral tie to the land, but then it also has this other thing, which is that we really didn't have any other choice. So to the extent that there may have been many Jews who over the generations really wished that we could just live peacefully in someone else's land, that if we just would be good residents or subjects or eventually citizens of someone else's land, that would also be okay, that we could be a forever diaspora people. Except for we couldn't, because for centuries, that was never okay. And when modern political Zionism started, that was really in response to kind of centuries-old oppression and attack that Jews had experienced due to pogroms and other attacks on Jewish communities. But it was still before the Holocaust, which is the worst pogrom that my people have ever experienced. So Zionism was in recognition, political Zionism, that being a distinct people in others' lands wasn't safe, and it wouldn't necessarily guarantee our continuity. And in fact, the Holocaust simply proved it right. Zionism wasn't a response to the Holocaust. Zionism was proven right by the Holocaust. And it was after the Holocaust, of course, that during the United Nations process of decolonization across the world, the State of Israel was established and the Zionist dream was fulfilled. But basically, that's a little bit about the story of Zionism.